Hello everyone. Before we begin talking about Show Don't Tell, I would like to thank everyone who liked, commented, and subscribed for my last video. I'm not a talker, I'm an awkward duck, so I hesitate a lot in my speech, and I struggle with sometimes explaining myself clearly. There is something reliable and comforting about writing. You can always fix what you write and tweak it before it goes out, but talking is always a bit more iffy. Stuff comes out of your mouth, and then you're all like Hagrid, like, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have said that. Still, everyone's general encouragement has made me believe that perhaps there are people out there who are interested in one awkward woman's lectures. So let's give this channel a go. More at the end of this video about the direction my channel will take. I want to just get into talking about Show Don't Tell. So let's first start with what I learned from the comment section. On my last video, a lot of people responded and gave their 2 cents. And my one takeaway was that my theory about writing in WoW being simply bad appears to be correct. It was indeed a common refrain that a lot of people were struggling with. But there are a lot of ways that bad writing can show itself. And so many different people had different opinions on how the bad writing was affecting the story. So that theory was correct, but I figured it as much because it is the simplest theory, and usually the simplest answer is the correct one. Now, a lot of people noted the narrative direction has had its ups and downs, and as a literary analyst and ghostwriter, and as an English language instructor and ex-elementary school teacher, I've had a lot of experience handling literature and writing, but even more importantly, I tend to notice patterns. And sometimes a pattern in society that happens in one area appears to erupt in other areas, hence why I made my previous video. I may elaborate more on male and female energy, especially creative energy, particularly in terms of Jungian definitions. So if you are more familiar with Jung and Jungian psychoanalysis, then you might enjoy some of my future videos. But today I want to talk more about bad writing. First, I want to preface this discussion that most often bad writing begins in the vision and planning stage, what writers call pre-writing, or what filmmakers call pre-production. Organization and coherence are crucial for determining what goes on in a story and how the story is told. So perhaps we could say something like this. Poor vision leads to poor direction. Poor direction leads to poor organization. And poor organization will lead to poor writing. This means that the actual writers of WoW who are writing the side stories, etc., may in fact show their writing chops, but are hamstrung by other directorial or leadership choices. It also makes me start wondering what caused poor vision in the first place. But that will require another video, I think, where I would sit around and theorize about the sociocultural or corporation-related factors that may have led to poor vision. So let's move on to what we really want to talk about. Bad writing and the current topic of the hour, Show Don't Tell. There are apparently a variety of cinematics in WoW lately that have people pissed off. Cinematics with Chromie acting too cutesy. Cinematics that fail to show mole cowboys being roasted alive. And one special cinematic talking about family. Lots of people have said, Show Don't Tell. And others have gotten into the argument defending WoW's approach. Let's talk about how everyone is wrong, or at least misled a little bit. In this video, I will define, discuss, explain, model, and analyze the Show Don't Tell mantra and the inevitable exceptions to the rule that occur. We will also dissect the family WoW cinematic. I say we because you too will be given a chance to flex your own analysis muscles after your accelerated literary training. Then I will make some suggestions about how to tweak the scene In the process, I think one of the fundamental issues that I've noted, and other folks commenting on my video have noted, will emerge from this discussion. Let's get started. The definition. Show don't tell is a modern paradigm for narrative. It is a way to think about how we tell stories. Do we just tell people what is happening internally or externally in a story? Or do we show what is happening? Many creative writing teachers will say things to beginning writers. Stuff like, write what you know. KISS, which stands for keep it simple, stupid. And of course, show don't tell. As a result, SDT, as I shall call it from now on, because I'm lazy, and because it sounds hilarious, like STD. But anyway, SDT is just a super popular approach to telling stories. But where did it all come from? Well, let's first look at the origin, because it is so crucial to find out why something happened before we really get to understand why it might be important or where we can challenge it. So a cursory search on the web will tell you that most people point the finger at Anton Chekhov for the whole concept. But I imagine that Chekhov was simply voicing popular ideas floating around his time, and it is very crucial at this stage to really consider Chekhov and his context. Chekhov actually said this famous, quote from a letter that he wrote to his brother. In descriptions of nature, one must seize on small details, grouping them so that when the reader closes his eyes, he gets a picture. For instance, you'll have a moonlit night if you write that on the mill dam, a piece of glass from a broken bottle glittered like a bright little star, and that the black shadow of a dog or a wolf rolled past like a ball. Now, this little quotation led to a very famous euphemism that people said Chekhov said, which is, "Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass." Now, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, Chekhov, or Anton Pavlovich Chekhov, was a playwright and a short story writer known for a very sparse and laconic style of writing. Now, perhaps he was suffering mental burnout after reading the Russian greats or something. But anyways, Chekhov, living in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, represents a shift into what we consider to be, quote-unquote, modern writing, what I will call modern storytelling. I'll dissect that in detail in another video I have planned and more or less recorded. At any rate, other writers emerged to more or less support this shift to showing, not telling. At this stage, I want us to stop and think about Chekhov in the context of other writers such as Mark Swan, a dramatist, and Percy Lubbock, Ernest Hemingway, and so on. All of these authors who really supported show don't tell. What happened at the turn of the century that would encourage this kind of discussion? Simple. The birth of the cinema. Playwrights and dramatists were popular, but after the arrival of the film, the talkies and so on, these writers found new life and cultural impact in a new job, screenwriting. Screenwriting, plays, and dramas are all similar in the sense that they rely on something that novelists don't have, the visual, the scene, the stage, and the actors. And this puts a whole new spin on the show don't tell discussion. So we need to keep this in the back of our mind when we talk about show don't tell. So let's really tackle the mystery and the complication of show don't tell. When we say show don't tell in writing, what do we mean? And is it the same as saying show don't tell in your cinematics? I would argue it isn't. We're comparing apples and oranges at this point because I think the conversation got oddly derailed from talking about a WoW cinematic to talking about STD approaches in classical literature. Even so, even in the world of cinema, rules exist. So let's unpack the two different realms of SDT, shall we? First, let's look at writing show don't tell. How do we do this? Writing SDT is infinitely difficult and will require time and practice. This is because SDT relies on a variety of skills and techniques to achieve the mental picture Chekhov was talking about. You will need to use a combination of figurative language, narrator techniques, dialogue mechanics, and grammatical structures to achieve this effect, not to mention leverage tone, mood, voice, and active-passive verbs. Let's break that down. Figurative language. Examples of figurative language would be metaphor, simile, onomatopoeia, allusion, alliteration, hyperbole, personification. These are all very different ways to use language, any language really, in order to create a picture. Figurative language is incredibly crucial for creating very unique descriptions. So besides figurative language, let's take a look at another important technique, the narrator. When you use third-person limited or omniscient narrator, with a complete removal of a spoken narrator, you can actually achieve a much more immediate sense of showing, not telling. Narrator techniques are very important in determining how close a person is to the action. Let's take a look at 3 examples. If you have The Magician's Nephew on your bookshelf, open it up and turn to the first page. I will open mine up and I'm going to read to you the first page. Well, not the whole first page, just the first paragraph or 2. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now. But meals were nicer, and as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days, there lived in London a girl called Polly Plummer. Okay, so that's the first couple paragraphs for Magician's Nephew. Now, let's pull out Fellowship of the Ring. All right, so let's turn. We're going to skip all of that front matter. We're going to even skip the prologue. We're going to skip the notes on the Shire records. I know, just terrible. You really should read them before you read the book, but let's start at the actual proper narrative, which is a long-expected party. And we're going to look at the first paragraph or 2. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was properly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure, and if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. And at 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that someone should possess apparently perpetual youth as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. It will have to be paid for, they said. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it. Okay. Now, I don't have Gardens of the Moons. I don't know where I put it. I'm kind of in the middle of preparing myself for a move to a... anyway. I can't seem to find the first book for the Malazan Empire. It's somewhere. So I'm going to read the opening prologue paragraph from Midnight Tides by Stephen Erickson. So this is part of the Malazan series. But I think it should, even if it's a book in the middle of the whole thing, I think it should still kind of highlight what I'm trying to say here. From the twisting, smoke-filled clouds, blood rained down. The last of the sky keeps, flame-wreathed and pouring black smoke, had surrendered the sky. Their ragged descent had torn furrows through the ground as they struck, and broke apart with thunderous reverberations, scattering red-stained rocks among the heaps of corpses that covered the land from horizon to horizon. The great hive cities had been reduced to ash-layered rubble, and the vast towering clouds above each of them that had shot skyward with their destruction, clouds filled with debris and shredded flesh and blood, now swirled in storms of dissipating heat, spreading to fill the sky. Amidst the annihilated armies, the legions of the conquerors were reassembling on the center plain, most of which was covered in exquisitely fitted flagstones, where the impact of the sky keeps had not carved deep gouges, although the reassertion of formations was hampered by the countless carcasses of the defeated, and by exhaustion. The legions belonged to two distinct armies, allies in this war, and it was clear that one had fared far better than the other. All right, so all of these are fantasy books, but they are all technically actually using third-person perspective. However, the narrative technique in Magician's Nephew, partially because it is intended to be a children's book, and partially because of C.S. Lewis's own personal style, has a perspective where you really get the sense that someone is telling you the story of Narnia. And they have opinions and ideas, and they are sharing them with you as they tell the story. So even though you could write Chronicles of Narnia as being third person with an incredibly removed spoken narrator, Lewis, for various reasons, has a very up front and center spoken narrator. And this causes a sense of more telling than showing, because there's someone that's telling you about this information. Okay, so the whole unexpected party with Bilbo Baggins, all of that is also similarly a third person perspective. The narrator is kind of there, but it's a step away removed. There still is a lot of telling. But the narrator isn't literally telling you. The narrator is a bit more removed from you, the reader. And then we have Stephen Erickson's Malazan Midnight Tides book. So in that book, we have an almost complete removal of the spoken narrator. And the narrator is quite distant or invisible. And this means that we are really interacting with what's going on in a much more personal sense. It's as close as you can get to personalizing the narrative as you can without going into first-person perspective. First-person perspective is very useful as well. It is more often used with books that are modern and more invested in the psychological journey of the character, but it could also really be helpful with making everything feel more immediate and more lived. Third person can feel a bit more distant, but there are ways to mitigate that. So narrative techniques, particularly in perspective, has to be considered when you are trying to show, don't tell. Dialogue is another way to create more show, don't tell. Using people talking through a situation with the careful use of dialogue tags can really bring movement to a scene and help a reader live through something alongside people who are interacting with an event, instead of just being like plonk, 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 this event happened. Tone is another way to show, don't tell. If you use tone properly, if you leverage connotation and denotation to determine the inference of meaning in words, you will be able to highlight the tone of the scene. So not all words have the same meaning, or they may have a same general meaning, but there's usually a connotation to different words over other words. And so once again, if you are careful about the tone and the kinds of words that you choose to describe things or to negotiate a dialogue or negotiate a scene, you will be able to show instead of just telling all the time. Mood is also a very handy device to use when showing, not telling. For example, if you use the weather, the environment, or other indirect emotional cues, you can nudge the reader towards a certain headspace that is more showing and not telling. So, for example, if you want to write a scene about someone being depressed, make the weather really gloomy to kind of highlight that depression. Or if you want to juxtapose it and just show how different they are compared to the actual situation, you will use the weather and make the weather really sunny and bright, and it's mocking them, as it were, and highlighting their low point. So you can use it either as a mirror or as a juxtaposition, the weather, the environment, and all of this kind of stuff to basically show, don't tell. You also really want to move away from using certain verbs like is or have or think, feel, say, these kinds of things. You want to really keep your verbs active. And this is because when you use stative verbs like is, or when you use verbs like have, think, feel, etc., you may end up falling into a pit of telling your reader what something is instead of showing them what something is. And that can be very damaging to the pacing. It can slow everything down. It can make everything seem more boring. And it feels very immature in terms of writing. Using sensory details to bring the environment to life is a crucial part of showing, not telling in writing. You really have to use all of your 5 senses. And if you think you can't taste, something in a bunker, you got to think about it in a fresh way to get all of that in there, because we actually rely on our sensory inputs to really experience our lives. Even if you're someone almost permanently at home like myself, you still have to deal with sensory details and sensory overloads and things like that. And so making sure to curate your sensory details is yet another thing you got to keep in mind when you are showing, don't telling. And then finally, your voice. All writers have a voice, have a personal way of writing. You got to manipulate your own writer's voice to explore a specific mood driving the scene. So remember to lean into your voice as a writer and try not to tell when you can show, but still remember that you have your own voice so that you can show, don't tell in your own unique kind of way. Let's look at some models, shall we? A lot of great modern writers like Hemingway relied on sensory details to make a scene come alive. Here's an excerpt from A Movable Feast, Chapter 1. Then there was the bad weather. It would come in one day when the fall was over. We would have to shut the windows in the night against the rain, and the cold wind would strip the leaves from the trees in the Place Contrescarpe. The leaves lay sodden in the rain, and the wind drove the rain against the big green autobus at the terminal. And the Café des Amateurs was crowded, and the windows misted over from the heat and the smoke inside. It was a sad, evilly run café where drunkards of the quarter crowded together, and I kept away from it because of the smell of dirty bodies and the sour smell of drunkenness. The men and women who frequented the Amateurs stayed drunk all of the time, or all of the time they could afford it, mostly on wine, which they bought by the half-liter or liter. Many strangely named aperitifs were advertised, but few people could afford them except as a foundation to build their wine drunks on. Okay, so that would be an excerpt from Hemingway. All right, all well and good. But what about fantasy stories? Well, let's take a little look at J.R.R. Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring, Chapter 1. And we're going to take a little look at the fireworks scene where Gandalf is setting off fireworks for the hobbits. There were rockets, like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke, their leaves open like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down upon the astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into the trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned into eagles, or sailing ships, or a phalanx of flying swans. There was a red thunderstorm and a shower of yellow rain. There was a forest of silver spears that sprang suddenly into the air with a yell like an embattled army, and came down again into the water with a hiss like 100 hot snakes. Now, this is followed by an equally stirring description of a dragon firework, but you can see, generally speaking, that writing can be extremely sensory, and it can show us what is happening, instead of just saying, and Gandalf set off a whole bunch of fireworks that were really cool, right? So there are going to be ways to describe particularly important things through showing, not telling. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions to the rule, and there is great literature out there that really do tell more than show. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, says, Anu granted him the totality of knowledge of all. He saw the secret, discovered the hidden. He brought information of the time before the flood. He went on a distant journey, pushing himself to exhaustion, and then was brought to peace. He carved on a stone stela all of his toils and built the wall of Uruk, Haven, the wall of the sacred Enna temple, the holy sanctuary. But even then, even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where there's a lot of talking about what people do, there are still moments where the writer waxes poetical. Okay, so here's an example. Supreme over other kings, lordly in appearance, he is the hero born of Uruk, the goring wild bull. He walks out in front, the leader, and walks at the rear, trusted by his companions. Mighty Net, protector of his people. Raging flood wave, who destroys even walls of stone. Offspring of Lugalbanda, Gilgamesh is strong to perfection. Son of the august cow, Rimat Ninsun. Gilgamesh is awesome to perfection. It was he who opened the mountain passes, who dug wells on the flank of the mountains. I also want to say that Tolkien also did a lot of telling, not showing. Tolkien, I can say, wasn't a professional writer. Okay, there's that. But also we can say that Lord of the Rings was an extension of a greater work. He was attempting to build a mythology for England. What that means and why that was important is something I might dig into greater detail in another video. In summary, the genre expectation he was going for, which was mythology, and the genre he actually created in the process, which is high fantasy, requires more telling than showing as a way to formalize and elevate the material. Other writers such as Orson Scott Card and James Scott Bell have come out to say that there is a time and place for telling. Telling is necessary to move things along because we can't literally tell everything. As writers, we are responsible for curating an experience of images for our readers, so we have to decide what to ignore, what to omit, what to gloss over, what to tell, and what to show. Writer intention, genre expectations, and a whole host of factors go into deciding what level of detail goes into any chosen scene. For nitpicky characters, taking the time to show their morning routine in excruciating detail might be crucial for building character, but for other characters, one may not really need to mention that they have a morning routine at all. It's a given. So once again, these are just off-the-cuff examples. Editors will usually come in and help shape your writing further, and it's a whole process, really. But when it comes to writing show don't tell, you really always need to be ready to learn. And it's a whole lifelong thing. So even I am not perfect. And we have to kind of keep in mind that everyone's on a journey. So when we are looking at our own writing, or when we're looking at anyone's writing, we have to ask, is it working? Is it showing, not telling? Do I need to show, not tell? What am I attempting to do? What is my genre and audience expectation? So we can consider this rubric that I made up. Do I use figurative language? Is my narrator absent or pulled back? Have I used dialogue optimally? How am I conveying tone? Are there other cues like the weather, environment, or other details to denote mood? How many active verbs have I used? Did I include as many sensory details as I could? How is my writer's voice helping or hindering show don't tell? So that is basically a summation about writing show don't tell. It's not easy, and not all genres require show don't tell, and we have to remember that show don't tell is a modern conception and is very powerful when used thoughtfully in writing. But what about filming show don't tell? What about that? Okay, so let's get into it. How do we show don't tell with film? Okay, well, we could just point the camera, right, and start acting in front of it. Well, it's more complex than that, right? I'm a bit of a behind the scenes kind of film person. I enjoy seeing how films are made. And when it comes to show don't tell on film, the high elevated aesthetes of film would say that there should be as little talking as possible. Hence why our films appear to be boring to a large portion of the population. The camera is just panning around environments and the conversation may appear desultory. British film personified, like in Eddie Izzard's sketch of British versus American films. But while British and American films might appear to be a juxtaposition of subsumed emotion to SFX high-octane energy, the truth is that even SFX high-octane energy requires show don't tell. You don't want or need someone to say, I'm blowing it up, while they're blowing it up. Unless they're on call with another character, but that's beside the point. You know what I mean. Usually in a good scene with show don't tell in a film, there's a balance of dialogue and movement. Actors are placed in the scene and directed to do things or give emotional cues through body language. Mood and tone are determined by lighting and the scene's environment and music. How the camera is pointed, who it is focusing on, and all manners of camera shots, wide, narrow, close, distant, will determine the energy and feel of the scene. Even more importantly, with the writing, don't have the characters explain what is happening unless there's a very good reason to do so. For example, if you're introducing something 110% brand new, or you're highlighting the stupidity of a character in the scene, or you're doing something for comedic effect, okay? Or maybe that character is extremely pedantic. But otherwise, you really should not have characters talking about something that you just seen. All right, so let's think about films in general. I could talk about some of the greats, right? But let's go for something like completely mass media. So I'm going to go with one of my favorite, films of all time, which would be Star Wars. And I'm thinking about things like Luke returning home and finding Owen and Beru, torched, right? And he's like, no. He's not like, oh no, Aunt Beru and Owen are dead. They really rely in some of those old Star Wars films on just showing what is happening and not necessarily telling what is happening all the time. There are moments, especially the big moments, are just showing the character. So for example, when Luke is in the trench run, he's struggling, he's, in his pilot mode, but he's not in the force mode. So then Obi-Wan's voice, Rip Alec Guinness, is like, Luke, let go or whatever. And it's very interesting because you don't see Luke verbalizing, I need to let go. I need to trust myself. I need to be one with the Force. Instead, you see him kind of breathe in. You see him push away the computer that was going to help him. And he's just breathing in and out kind of thing. So to me, I think it's very moving and a very fascinating and almost beautiful scene, really, if we think about it. And then, for example, okay, maybe episode 4 is too good of a film. So we could even look at episode 1, which is one of like the most lowbrow, other than, of course, the J.J. Abrams stuff and the episode 8, which shall not be named. But if we look at episode 1, for example, Anakin is helping to deal with the Neimoidians or whatever they were called. And Qui-Gon tells him to stay hidden in the ship. But of course, Anakin's going to end up on his own little adventure. And at one point he's like, now this is pod racing, as he's like blowing up droids and, basically on autopilot to the center of the... Anyway, it's a whole thing, right? It's really dorky. But they're showing us what's going on, right? They don't have a scene afterwards where Anakin's like, oh yeah, while you guys were fighting Darth Maul, I actually shot up the core of the space station or whatever. Like, they don't rely on Anakin telling everyone what he's done. We get to see what Anakin did, even if it was super dorky. Okay, so film show don't tell in a nutshell is basically why talk when you can show. Now you might be going, okay, but what about quiet films or like chick flicks, right? There's tons of talking in that. And yes, that is true. There are a lot of people talking, but almost all of that dialogue, especially with the really good films, the dialogue is all curated and written to highlight the characters, their personalities, and their psychological journey, okay? It's not just crap thrown in there. It's curated writing, usually relying a bit on what I talked about in the first portion, which is writing show don't tell. And they will have these carefully formed scripts that will highlight what kind of a person this is through talking. And that's why I said dialogue is a crucial way to show don't tell. But how you use that dialogue is really, really important. What you're saying is really important. And in between that, when you can, just have the actors acting the heck out of it, right? So in the BBC Pride and Prejudice, which is with Colin Firth and Jennifer Ely, Elizabeth is playing the piano, and Darcy is just sitting there staring at her in a very intense way. Like, it gives me shivers thinking about it. Or, the infamous swimming scene, where we see Darcy in this intimate setting. It wasn't in the book, they put it in the movie, and it was super effective. Why? Well, it caught and maintained female interest. And of course, it provided eye candy for Elizabeth and the viewers. But even more importantly, it made Darcy more vulnerable and more accessible. So that when he bumps into Elizabeth after his swim, he's kind of caught off guard. He's disheveled. He's not looking perfect. And it's kind of like a metaphor for how he is opening up to Elizabeth psychologically and emotionally. Another example is the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, the modern one. All right, so they could have had a hard cut in this one scene and showed the next season, and they're talking about how their life has been and how busy they've been, etc. What do the filmmakers do? Well, what they did is they put Keira Knightley on a swing, and they had her like twirling around, or they had the camera twirling around her. And as the camera moves around her, it showed the changing seasons. And it was really beautiful. There are definitely many ways for the filmmaker, for the director, for the cinematographer to kind of take control of a scene and properly use dialogue and acting and everything to create a picture for us. And it's not just saying very obvious things. Now, of course, there are going to be really shitty films with lots of people standing around telling things and, with very obvious dialogue. We all know it's bad, and we all know it's laughable. It is what it is. And of course, kids' stuff tends to be more tell, don't show, for the obvious reason that kids have lower comprehension as a rule. But even famous kids' films, like Disney in the old days, attempted to show, don't tell. So, like, for example, in Cinderella's wake-up scene, we got to see how poor she was, how kind she was, her living situation. In just a few minutes, we could make a guess about Cinderella's state. And another very hilarious show, don't tell sequence in Disney that still involved a lot of talking was Mulan with the matchmaker. Just rewatch that again. You get to see Mulan as a character. You get to see the matchmaker and what she represents in terms of social expectations. And you can see this clash, and it's funny, and there's a lot of funniness going on, but there's also a lot of subtext going on, and it's just really great. Now, of course, as always, there are exceptions to the rule. Now, if there are films with heavy politicking or high drama with a lot of people involved, there's going to be lots of talking. There's going to be a lot of people telling about things that you may not have always seen. Now, if you are doing a film about a book, you may often have to resort to telling with references to original material from the novel. So, for example, the Council of Elrond was a particular struggle for Peter Jackson because the Council of Elrond, let's all be real, in the book is a lore dump, right? It's an absolute lore dump. Most people give up during the Council of Elrond. That's like the litmus test for can you handle Tolkien? Can you get through Council of Elrond? Now, putting that in a film, attempting to show don't tell, was really hard. And it resulted in a lot of talking being cut out from the original dialogue that was spoken in the book. A lot of people were reduced to very generic phrases, but I was not upset because I understood that film is not novel, and what you can get away with a novel is less forgiven in a film. So I was not one of those Tolkien purists who were foaming at the mouth. I leaned back and I was like, it is what it is what it is. For me, I think there was a lot going on, and the music really helped the reminder of the immediacy of the Sauron problem with the flashing eye and the rumbling voice as everyone starts arguing was really great. But then I start thinking, are there other ways that people have touched on important lore or information while in some ways showing not telling? And I thought about the use. I don't know if anyone has seen the recent Dune 2017 film. I don't know if any of you have seen that. I loved it. And there was the use of an audiobook. That's what I'm going to call it anyway. The use of an audiobook in the recent Dune film to introduce Arrakis. So we have Paul listening to some kind of like documentary or something. But instead of just having Paul sitting and listening to this, information dump, Villeneuve instead had Paul interacting with a hologram to show this little mouse in the sand among the scrub. And it kind of did a few things. First, it showed how Paul was invested in learning everything he could about this planet that his family were destined to go to. And that was really great for Paul's character. It also set up the mouse with the scrub, which I took to be a metaphor or image of basically what would be the Fremen and survival, more or less. And sure enough, later in the film, the mouse comes back during a moment where you have Paul once again, facing difficulty, and he is basically the mouse in the scrub. And I thought that was very beautiful to me. And I thought it was a great way to info dump on people who might be interested in finding out about Arrakis before we get there. And at the same time, set up this theme or this picture that would reoccur later. So what kind of rubric could we create for Show Don't Tell? All right, well, how about these questions? How much dialogue do I have in the scene? Is it appropriate? Is it saying anything I could show instead? Could I cut it and still be understood? How are the actors moving or acting? How are they placed in the scene? What is their body language supposed to be? What emotional cues am I giving viewers? How is my lighting, prop use, and music helping to support the action in and the goals of the scene? Are the camera angles used thoughtfully? What kinds of shots would enhance the tone of the scene? Now let's stop here and consider the WoW cinematic. Pause my video, go watch it, and come back. Let's start asking ourselves a few basic questions about the WoW cinematic. The most obvious question needs to be asked. Which Show Don't Tell standard should be applied to it, writing or filming? Once you write down your answer, look at the rubric I shared, analyze the cinematic, and write down some of your thoughts and responses to the cinematic. After you've done that, return to my video and unpack what I'm seeing here. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've done all of the above. Let's start analyzing the WoW cinematic. What is happening? First, we get a bunch of people receiving their power back from Azeroth. They realize two things. The power could only be given, and what they really treasure is the family they discovered along the way. Now, let's use the rubric to figure out how the scene is doing. And guess what? I'm actually going with the film Show Don't Tell, because this is, at the end of the day, a cinematic. So let's start out with the stuff that is good. How is my lighting, prop, use, and music helping to support the action in and the goals of the scene? I would say overall, yes, the music is pretty good. The coloring and lighting of the scene is appropriate to what is happening. I personally would have done it differently. I'll talk about that later. But overall, I think it's totally fine and totally appropriate. Are the camera angles used thoughtfully? What kinds of shots would enhance the tone of the scene? Once again, I don't think this is very terrible. I think there could have been different shots, but generally speaking, I thought that the beginning with the swirling around as the magic returns and the close-up of Alexstrasza's eyes as they flare with power is very strong. I really like those shots. How are the actors moving or acting? How are they placed in the scene? What is their body language supposed to be? Now, at first, I would say this was pretty good. We have people floating and being filled with power. We have wonderment on their faces because they're surprised. But after that, it's just people standing about as they talk in some glowing place. It's a bit slow, in my opinion. Okay, so let's get to the bad. How much dialogue do I have in the scene? Is it appropriate? Is it saying anything I could show instead? Could I cut it and still be understood? I would say that a lot of the dialogue could be cut. And this is where, for me, stuff just starts going off the rails. I mean, look at this dialogue. All right, so I'm going to put it on the screen. But basically, we have Kay saying, how could this be? Our aspectral powers ... have returned. N says, this is not the Titan's magic. V says, this is of our world, yet unlike anything I've known. M says, Emir Drasil has left the dream, and while the aspects once gave their blessing to the world trees, this time. And then E, Abyssian, says, Azeroth blessed us. I felt her presence. It was beautiful. Okay. After that, Alexstrasza chimes in. Now I understand. I thought to survive, we need to reclaim our aspectral powers, but they were never ours to take. K says it was about coming together as a family. M says, and so we did. N says, perhaps as we were always meant to. A says, all of us. When the Titans granted us power, it divided dragonkind. V says, but in uniting for a cause greater than ourselves, Azeroth's gift has made us at last truly whole. A says, we will use these lessons old and new to protect our world as her aspects. Now, at this point, you might as well have Blippi or Steve from Blue's Clues come on screen and remind kids not to run with scissors while you're at it. I mean, the first line could be chalked up to shock, so let's forgive that. Have a bit of a response. Go, oh, have they returned? Okay, that's fine. Let's have Nozdormu talking about Titan magic. That might be helpful for anyone who's skipped a previous scene or MSQ dialogue. I mean, those people exist, so having that in there is fine. And then, include everything up to Abyssian, I'm not sure, saying Azeroth blessed us. All that is okay. However, telling us that Azeroth's presence was beautiful is telling, not showing. Alexstrasza having her realization could be helpful, but the whole family thing comes off as cringe because there's no show don't tell. It comes off as some kind of PSA or ham-fisted lesson for kids at the end of a Saturday morning cartoon. It was about coming together as a family. I mean, think about just the choice of words. It's just very childish and modern. What emotional cues am I giving the viewers? Well, at this point, nothing, am I right? Any kind of wonderment in the first 5 seconds is literally erased by the over-explaining that follows. This is definitely the case of too much talking. Talking makes stuff mundane to a degree, especially when a moment is supposed to be profoundly spiritual. There is a reason why monastic orders have enforced periods of silence, and why the chaotic power of nature and space is explored without constant chatter. There's this scene in an X-Files episode called Ice, where this guy puts his headphones on to listen to the play-by-play of a baseball game. He does that for a reason. It's because hearing people talking calms you down. It makes you feel not alone. But if you're trying to attempt something that's elevated and spiritual, you need to have less talking. Silence brings out a lot of truths in ourselves, and silence, when used well, like look at Ghibli, for example, can say a lot more, particularly in film. So, how do we fix the WoW cinematic? Now that we know the problem, let's fix the cinematic. Here's my suggested breakdown. Part of this is based on Akalon's talk with me on his stream. First camera shot. A dimly lit space is filled with warm light as a camera swirls around people being filled with magic. It goes from a darker toned space to a lighter toned space, helping to emphasize the change and support the underlying themes of transformation. Second camera shot, which was Akko's idea, cut to Azeroth or the World Tree waking and saying come, or whatever is said. Make this as beautiful and ethereal as possible. Music here must be super gorgeous but ephemeral. Third camera shot. Cut to Alexstrasza's eyes opening, now filled with magical flames. Fourth camera shot. Show a wide shot of everyone standing shoulder to shoulder, surveying an epic landscape. Someone like Alexstrasza says, "It is time to fulfill our duty as we should have done. Protect our world as her aspects." Now, you may have noticed there's no talk about family. But, so this might be a problem. Like, if you as a writer really want to add in that, bonus about talking about family, what we could do is one of two things. Number one, after the second camera shot, which is the World Tree waking up. So after that, show a montage of everyone learning how to work together. And change the last sentence to, "It is time to fulfill our duty as we should have done, unite, and protect our world as her aspects, ... together." Or, after her eyes, Alexstrasza's eyes open, have them kind of standing together, looking over the epic landscape. And Nozdormu will say something like, "Azeroth has blessed us." And Alexstrasza will say, "Now I understand. I thought to survive we needed to reclaim our aspectral powers, but they were never ours to take. And then Abyssian would say, indeed, and the true blessings have been the bonds we have forged. And then cut to the flashback showing everyone learning how to work together, and change the last sentence to, once again, it is time to fulfill our duty as we should have done, unite and protect our world as her aspects together. Now, this might highlight a large issue in WoW that I've heard from the players. I can already see some people raising their hand in the back of the class going, a teacher, Kurokuma, where are these flashbacks coming from? Good question. I asked some WoW players after reading their responses and considering the responses to my previous video, and I've discovered that there isn't much in terms of cinematic showing people working together. Someone pointed out there's a final cinematic in the Shadowlands raid where you take down the jailer, and it seems like a large portion of these characters were there to help or to do a majority of that. Other people suggested that the story in Shadowlands was so poorly constructed that there is literally no material to show this group of people, Nosdormu and Abyssian and so on, Kalikos and Alexstrasza and all these people. There's not enough material to show them really working together, really learning what they're talking about in the scene. Someone noted that there is a quest line centered around Blue Dragon Flight where Kalikos is the aspect, and it's about the idea of reuniting the flight. But once again, does that relate to Alexstrasza, Abyssian, and everyone else? I don't know. My takeaway from it is that the story is too fragmented between the different mediums of the text boxes in the game and the novels and the cinematics, that there's no actual material for the writers and the director to provide a flashback material or any supporting showing material. So they have to rely on telling us the point that they wanted to make. And this, unfortunately, makes them look very amateurish as filmmakers. And even at this point, having a long-winded dialogue might even be better than nothing. So, even if they had replaced all of this, we have been divided, but now we're whole. If we'd replaced all of that dialogue with, we have learned that the true blessing is the bonds we have forged. Yes. Do you remember that time when there was that time when you and I, or when I first met you, I thought this, but now I realize, so on and so forth. Now, that could slow down the scene dramatically and make it infinitely longer. And people might just get super bored and peace out. But maybe there are tons of players who wouldn't mind actually having people sharing their memories, because it might be better than having nothing at all and just having them say words that has not been properly supported by anything in the game. In summary, ultimately, WoW hasn't broken the rule of show don't tell for writing per se. It's done something worse, in my opinion. It broke the rules of show don't tell for film. And while there are times and places for characters to sit or stand around and talk about lore or information, something as powerful and dramatic as receiving your powers back should never be reduced to a PSA about the importance of family. Ultimately, you have to feel confident as a director, filmmaker, and writer that you've provided a string of supporting events to bring your audience to the natural conclusion you wanted to reach. If you have to state something obvious like it's about family, the truth is that you probably had a serious misstep somewhere in terms of narrative structure. And this is where WoW seems to be struggling. If they want to shift the narrative to a focus on the psychology of the characters or growth of the characters to prepare the next narratives for a more coherent MSQ style story like FF14, that's fine, perhaps. But they can't just come out of nowhere and say, we learned to be like family, if there are no moments to recall for the audience to say, oh yeah, they learned to be like family. So if you can't show it, then don't say it. And if you can show it, don't say it. Just don't say something so obvious. Now, you might say, well, in 14, there are a ton of people sitting around talking. Well, 14, first off, isn't a perfect game either, okay? So there are things in 14 that need to be fixed. Now, the story for me is S tier. And I'm going to talk about 14 and try to really highlight where I think it does well. So number one, the amount of cinematics and straightforward MSQ in 14 compared to WoW is much higher. So there's going to be scenes with people talking about things that happened off screen. It's just going to happen. There's just way more content in terms of MSQ than what you get in WoW. So obviously that's going to crop up on occasion. It's unavoidable. And there's, once again, as I said before, there's nothing wrong in breaking a rule as long as you know what you're doing when you do it. Number two, important events that the writers want you to experience, even if not directly related to your character, are revealed. And some stuff is even playable, like the Gaius Estinian stuff in Shadowbringers. So while you're doing Shadowbringers, you also have these moments where you get to check in on Gaius and Estinian. And it's really crucial to kind of keep on top of what's going on in the source while you're somewhere else. And basically, it's really crucial to also have gameplay, which is what happens. It's very cool. If you haven't got to Shadowbringers, get there. That story will literally blow your mind. Number three, your character is in the scene, often giving lines, albeit superficial reactions to what is going on. So in 14, even when they're talking about something you may not have yet known or you're just learning about or whatever, your character is there reacting to it. Now, I've heard that WoW is now putting your character into the scenes, and that is so good. I'm glad to hear that. I just think it works much better. And in 14, your character is not just in the scene and sometimes, responding with lines, but the characters as well, number 4, will interact with your character with body language and other emotes and things like that. And also, everything that you do learn, let's say in one talking scene, then usually the next few quests, or at some point later on down the road, it's going to matter in gameplay terms, in very impactful narrative ways. If there's any telling and not showing, almost immediately it's followed by showing to really bring it home. Music and tone, number 5, are often considered in the cutscenes. Those will often play a large part. Probably one of the most impactful scenes for me wasn't the death of Horshavat, it was going and telling his dad about what happened. And that whole scene with the music actually got to me. That got to me really hard. Number 6, MSQ scenes are broken up with quests or duties that are designed to make you live what is going on. So recently, my sister and I, we've been going through Shadowbringers. It's her first playthrough. Sin Eaters are attacking a village. You aren't just told about it. You get to go and run a solo duty to fight the Sin Eaters and see how people are being literally slaughtered before your eyes. You end with a great cinematic showing Ardbert and Lena, who are important NPCs. You get to see them process loss and helplessness. My sister did not cry, she wants to assert. Yeah, lots of, tears. Number 6, major drama moments rely on flashbacks that you will recognize to make a point about something that happened before, and therefore supports what is happening now. So there's no unnecessary PSAs. So when someone will say, we've been on this journey together, they will then usually have like flashbacks to show what kind of journey you've been on. And this particularly comes into play in Endwalker, which sums up the 10-year cycle. Finally, number 7, the way that big thematic topics are handled are much more lived, experienced, and shown. So concepts like family, stoicism, hope, these kinds of things are very important and you as a writer might want to share something with your readers, it's very important not to get preachy. Preachiness turns people off. Instead, you want people to live through it. So the last zone of Endwalker, for example, Matsia's run with the baby. If you know, you know. If you know, you know. And, the solo duty I just talked about in Shadowbringers is really hitting home the concept of hollow victory and dealing with helplessness and loss. They don't tell you pick yourself up because that's how you get through life. Ardbert talks about it in a poetic way that says the same thing without really being cringy about it. And it might even have to do with the style of writing as well. The style of writing more medieval dialogue it can be hard to really pin down sometimes. In short, there are ways to mitigate the three major challenges of all stories, particularly fantasy stories. So, for example, lore info dumps, nitty-gritty routine events, and thematic elements are major challenges for writing. And some of these have to be mitigated by telling. For example, nitty-gritty routine events. You sometimes have to brush over stuff like that using telling. But you can mitigate some of this by using flashbacks, inserting dynamic gameplay, relying on realistic dialogue that reveals but doesn't tell, show emotions through the face and body language, choosing, appropriate music, all of that. This way, if you have to state something, then at least you're doing it in an interesting way and you aren't treating your audience like children. Well, that's about it, I guess. That's my TED Talk for the day. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this makes sense for all MMO enjoyers and gamers out there. And hopefully it gets you thinking about how you might tackle a scene when writing, or how you might analyze scenes moving forward. Now, about this channel going forward, my future. I'm hoping to post more videos more frequently. I'm hoping 1 video a week, but that might be just hubris talking at this point, because I do teach actually part-time, and I am a ghostwriter as well. And more recently, I have decided to embark on launching a pseudonym in a very specific writing niche, which is also taking up my time. So we shall have to see what I can do in terms of putting out videos. And I have to admit, I didn't really think people would listen. So now I'm thinking, okay, maybe people are interested in hearing what a writer and, literature graduate have to say. Maybe people out there want to hear some more based, I guess, takes on literature and IPs. I thought I was a bit boring, but I guess some people are not bored. So I'm going to have to fix my recording situation, and I'm going to have to set myself up so I can basically prepare content ahead of time. But I think I would like to hang out here and chat more about books and games if anyone wants to listen. I will always stick to a more lecture-based podcast formula with very simple graphics. I think it would be great if people are able to listen to me while driving or whatever. Maybe one day I can update my actual video editing skills, such as they are. But I can't promise that for now. What I am going to work on is improving my recording situation, because I'm having some technical difficulties. So what kind of stuff do I plan to talk about? I'm hoping to review books and recommend books. I'd like to analyze game narratives. I'd like to discuss lore for games I enjoy. I want to compare and contrast ideas between different games. I'd like to maybe lecture on literary devices, techniques, and other important information I've studied over the years. I would not be against reacting to specific cinematics or passages in books. I hope I can talk about MMOs and game stories. in the future. Maybe if I attempt WoW again, I will share that. I will probably talk about my WoW journey and some of my struggles. And then finally, for those who are on a writing journey like myself, maybe I will talk about some tips and some viewpoints I have kind of developed over the decades. I can't believe I'm saying decades, but I guess I'm at that stage in life now. But maybe we can learn from each other. So writers, feel free to chime up in the comment section. But maybe there are some points of view that I, as a writer, might inspire other people, or at least encourage them to stick to who they are as writers. And yeah, if there's anything you'd like me to talk about, let me know in the comment section below. And like, subscribe, comment on this video, and I'll see you around next time.